Tonight, for our special news segment celebrating Brazil's independence, we have a debate arguing how Portugal and Brazil saw their colonization. Here are our representatives. From Portugal, we have Sanita, and from Brazil, we have Isabella.
For the first portion of our debate, me and Sunita will be arguing about the government, economy, and social issues of colonial Brazil under Portugal. It is my belief that the government during colonial Brazil was concerned mostly with economic affairs. Brazil was seen mostly as a natural resource, and sugar exports, they peaked around the 1650s, and after that, a lot of Brazil kind of fell into poverty, and the government didn't care because they found other natural resources, to keep the economy going.
But you can definitely tell that the people in Portugal did care about the Brazilians, because when they first saw the people in Brazil, they saw just a group of people that needed help, because in a Brown University packet, they say that the population could be described as savage, naked, fierce, and man-eating. If Portugal had not taken over Brazil, there would be basically no economy, and so they used the natural resources just so that the people wouldn't have been in poverty, and had they not taken over, they would have been in poverty anyways.
The indigenous Brazilians were not in poverty. They had an advanced society.
In Brazil, the early Portuguese settlers were Jesuit missionaries from the Catholic Church and colonial officers and merchants. These Jesuit settlers established missions that tried to educate the indigenous population and through the church. So they basically gave the people a way to unite themselves and have a good society.
I think the church acted too much as part of the government, though. Instead of creating legitimate laws and rules for people to follow, they turned people to slaves when they didn't want to convert, and used papal edicts from a pope that was thousands and thousands of miles away that these people would never meet. So I don't think that, despite what the church did do for people, I don't think it was meant to do that much. It wasn't supposed to serve as the government. It should have been. Religion is a private thing and not a matter of the state. The church even made it legal to turn indigenous Brazilians who refused converting to Catholicism. It legalized turning them into slaves, and that's an even worse position than they were in their indigenous society, or even when the Portuguese came over. Now they weren't even just poor, they were slaves. They weren't paid, and they did whack drinking labor for hours on end, and many of them died within as little as 3 years.
Just as you said, the church was able to make things legal and other things illegal, so you could kind of think of them even as a smaller scale governing body of Brazil. And the church is actually what gave the Portuguese the land.
But the church had no authority to give that land. They had no jurisdiction over that land. They had no outpost in that land until the Portuguese landed there. The land belonged to the native Brazilians, or it belonged to nobody. The land doesn't need an owner.
But when you think about it, the church was made up of native Brazilians, so it's almost like they helped make the decision, and it was a decision as
But that was after the colonization of Brazil.
Right.
Prior to the colonization of Brazil, before even setting sail, the Portuguese received a statement from the church saying, "You have this land in here, and you have this land here, and we as a church give it to you." And this was before they even set foot on the continent of South America. So the church, before it was comprised of native Brazilians, was composed entirely of Europeans who had no jurisdiction over the land they were distributing.
Although that's true, I feel like we should move on to the social impacts of Brazil from the Portuguese.
Well, I think that the Portuguese had a lot of really negative impacts on Brazil, especially in the social realm, because they really instituted the idea of slavery. Previous to the Portuguese, there may have been some intertribal war between the indigenous peoples and minor form slavery, but the Portuguese introduced it en masse, and it not only affected their economy, it affected the way people viewed themselves and other races.
But in terms of economy, the crop turnout was the main source of money for Brazil, and slavery helped with this, and it allowed the economy to thrive more. So the economy would have failed if the Portuguese hadn't implemented slavery in Brazil.
Well, I think that for more on this issue, we should throw it to our colleagues because they have more information on social issues. Our colleagues are Sarah representing Brazil and Arusha representing Portugal. So I think we should go to them.
Thanks, Isabella. When we talk about Portugal relying on the colonies, I feel like it was the other way too. The colonies needed Portugal too for the basic needs, money, the resources, guidance, etc. And I feel like this is the basis of imperialism and why it exists. Additionally, the Portuguese brought Catholicism to Brazil, which allowed for a more united society. I have a quote from the textbook which stated that the Portuguese settlers eagerly adopted Indian cultures such as the hammock. This suggests that the Portuguese accepted all the different cultures and they did not differentiate between people. Moving on, talking about the daily lives, I have a quote from the World Economy, which said that they did not find an advanced civilization with hordes of precious metals for plunder, or a social discipline and organization geared to provide steady tribute which they could appropriate. Brazilian Indians were mainly hunter-gatherers, though some were moving towards agriculture using slash and burn techniques to cultivate manioc. Their technology and resources meant that they were thin on the ground. They had no towns, no domestic animals, no technology. So the Portuguese had to really bring in a lot of new sources and just turn the game around. And I think they did that really well. They introduced new agriculture, new ways to live, new occupations, and I think that really helped Brazil greatly to advance as a country later on. Like if maybe the slaves might be like a little inhumane at that time, but I feel like later on that's what helped them, and the slaves greatly helped the economy too. When we talk about natural resources, Portugal found gold in Brazil and used it greatly towards their economy. The gold industry was at its peak around 1750 with production around 15 tons a year, and in the first half of the 18th century, profit remittances from gold averaged 1.4 million pounds a year, said the same source. This shows how greatly Portugal helped Brazil develop and grow as a country now known by everyone, and Portugal basically set the basis for the Brazilians to advance and thrive later on in life.
Thanks, Arushi. My name is Sarah, and I'm going to be representing Brazil. So, after the Portuguese arrived, there were mainly four groups of people that were in society. These were the whites, the slaves, the mulattoes, and the free persons of color. Now, the daily lives of each of those people were very different, and as we can see in today's society, there's still a very large gap between the rich and the poor and the white and the black. The idea of these different races in society is also tied in with miscegenation and the whitening of the Brazilian culture. So to begin, I want to first explore the whitening of the Brazilian culture. First, Oliveira Viana, a sociologist well-versed in ethnic literature of Europe and the United States, further validates the occurrence of the whitening of the Brazilian population in the following quote. The superior mixed bloods, those who during the long period of our national development have risen socially, do not rise nor establish themselves because of their mixed blood mentality, instead of preserving as they climbed the characteristics of their hybrid type. They, on the contrary, lost those very characteristics, left off being psychologically mixed. However, I do want to point out that the whitening of the Brazilian culture is not merely a side effect of inter-ethnic mixing, but has been significantly viewed as an elitist tool for achieving the goal of a white Brazilian nation. So the gradual demolition of the African savage presence was seen as the solution to Brazil's problems of development. And I quote, if according to the scientific racism dominant in this period, miscegenation and cultural blending were the disease, whitening through miscegenation and the Europeanization of Brazilian culture was the Brazilian elite's prescription for a cure. Thus, whitening techniques such as miscegenation and European immigrants were seen as the solution to the nation's problems. So miscegenation was encouraged to the extent that, according to Reginald Daniels' Race and Multiraciality in Brazil and the United States Converging Paths, by 1888, mulattoes outnumbered blacks by as much as 4 to 1 in areas of employment. The ultimate goal was basically to wipe out the black population and whiten society as a whole. So the next source we will be going to is a painting done by Modesto Brocos, who shows a very dark-skinned grandmother holding her hands raised in a gesture of thanks to God for the white grandchild. And thus was born the mulatto, otherwise known as a mixed-race individual who is both African American and white. So now I want to talk about the daily lives of these people. So these mulattoes were not as poor as slaves, but they were also never able to reach the status of the white elite. So for most of the time, they were able to climb the social ladder in society by marrying the rich white. However, many whites were not happy about the sheer number and power the mulattoes had started to gain. In one quote from a prominent white man, he states, "I'm going to get out Bahia and go to Sao Paulo. This town is too full of mulattoes and of mulatto traits. The mulatto is not like the black. He is a person without character. He has no honor. He's always envious, he's jealous, he's busy maintaining himself, pushing himself in where he isn't wanted, that he can't tend to his business or to his job. He can't do anything except to make of himself a general nuisance." So the daily life of a mulatto ranged from being a cook to a servant for a white master, and generally these jobs were much better off than those of the slaves, because the slaves had to do the back-breaking work and toiled in the fields for extremely long hours. So life was harder for them. Life was harder for the mulattoes compared to the slaves. So the life of a white was much better compared to those of the blacks, and the white elite got to decide whether or not to extend land rights, credit, and protection to subsistence farming of color. And this was really important because from this we can just basically tell that the whites had all the power in society.
Thanks for talking to us today, Arushi and Sarah.
We hope our debate was entertaining and informative. That's it for today.
Good night.